Hello, and welcome to WTF News, where unlike other networks, we don't pretend to give you objective news. Rather, here at WTF, we're proud to present our biased opinions on the major issues facing our society today. Issues ranging from gun safety to immigration, from religion to equal rights, and from Congress to God. I'm Dan Gersten, WTF News anchor, and I'm opinionated as shit. I mean, not that shit has much of an opinion, or one that any of us might care to listen to, just that there's a lot of shit out there. And we're here to talk about it with the help of some illustrious and famous guests. So why don't we get started by talking about our government, as millions of Americans are frustrated as hell with it. I mean, blaming many of the nation's ills on our elected officials. I mean, some place the evils of our society solely on President Barack Obama, saying he's fucking un-American, being a commie pinko Muslim socialist, and an agent of Satan. Others blame Congress, either as a whole or directing their anger, frustration, and disappointment toward one particular political party. Others still blame both the president and Congress, while there's a relatively large segment of the population that's so fucking disgusted that they don't give a crap who's to blame. At WTF, we care. And we make sure that our audience knows where to place the majority of blame for how fucked up our government is. And that's squarely on conservative white Republican assholes and their evil stepchild, the fucking Tea Party. Now, whether or not you agree with us, we're hoping that you do agree that partisanship in Congress is to the detriment of America, and that when Congress and the president work well together for the common good, that all Americans benefit. And to help us discuss this and other topics, I'd like to welcome in our panel of experts. From his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, Revolutionary War hero, founding father, and our first president, George Washington. Mr. President, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan. And please, just call me George. You know, I'm not really into those formalities. It's one of the reasons I didn't want to become king. So around here, most people just call me George. Well, except for Martha, that is.
What does Mrs. Washington call you?
As general and as president, I felt it was important to learn the art of diplomacy. So in that spirit, I prefer not to answer that question.
Fair enough. From his home in Sagamore Hill, New York, noted author, war hero, naturalist, and trust buster, our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt. Mr. President, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan, and please call me Colonel. I really can't stand being called Theodore, and Theo sounds too, well, affected, and I'm not the affected kind.
What about Teddy?
Can't stand it. It's vulgar. It's an outrageous impudence. And as a child, I was called Teddy, and I got nauseous just thinking about it. So, please, call me Colonel. Political friends and others who work closely with me customarily address me by that rank.
Well, okay then. And lastly, though not a president, a king. From the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, celebrated Indian fighter, congressman, and teller of tall tales, Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Congressman Crockett, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I sure love talking. And please call me David. While millions of Americans may know me as Davy, I really was called David most of my life.
Before we start, I'd like to show a clip of the late Senator Al Inspector of Pennsylvania on Fox News, Sunday, December 27, 2009, talking about the GOP's strategy to make Obama a one-term president and make bipartisanship a sin. Let's watch.
So that before the ink was dry on the oath of office, and I know this because I was in the caucus, the Republicans were already plotting ways to beat President Obama in 2012. Now, effective government in a democracy relies upon some bipartisanship, but there simply isn't any, and the process which was used was not good. The lead story today in the Washington Post is that after you reform health care, you ought to reform the Senate.
So let's start with President Washington, since he was first. George, I know you're on record as being against partisan politics and had to act as a referee between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson on numerous occasions. And you had some words to that effect when you left office.
In my farewell address upon leaving the presidency, I warned against bitter partisanship in domestic politics. I call for men to move beyond partisanship and to serve the common good. Well, so much for that warning. Partisanship now runs amok in the city named for me and throughout this land. The common good is no longer common. And I and the founding fathers, oh, we are not happy.
And there's not much worse than a founding father not happy with what he sees in the country he founded. Turning now to Colonel Roosevelt. Sir, you had the opportunity to work with the support of Congress when you were president, especially when it came to consumer protection, being able to pass crucial laws like the Meat Inspection Act and the very first Pure Food and Drug Act.
But still, the beef industry fought against passage of the Meat Inspection Act, and in that same industry, as well as other food producers and medicine makers, had a well-funded and vocal lobbying association. What it comes down to is this. In addition to me, you have to thank the congressmen of the time who cared more about the health and safety of Americans rather than the health and well-being of the food industry or their bank accounts. And I dare say many were Republicans.
Yes, I mean, quite a comparison between Republicans of your day and the Republican Party of today when it comes to putting the welfare of Americans above wealthy and powerful individuals and corporations.
Yes, I've been watching with a mixture of shock and disappointment.
Well, it's shocking and disappointing to me and millions of Americans as well. Turning now to David Crockett. David, you served in Congress for 3 terms, supporting the rights of people, which included Native Americans and squatters. And you were critical about Congress members who had no problem giving away taxpayer money, but wouldn't spend a dime of their own.
I supported the rights of squatters, who were barred from buying land in the West without already owning property. I also railed against some of my congressional colleagues who were willing to spend taxpayer dollars to help a widow of a U.S. Navy man who had lived beyond his service but would not contribute their own salary for a week to her cause.
Not so different today. Here we are in 2013, and our nation is experiencing one of the worst economic downturns in our history, and with a huge deficit. And fucking Republicans and Tea Partiers in Congress want to cut social programs for Americans while enjoying taxpayer-paid benefits and having a ludicrous taxpayer-paid pension. You'd think if they wanted average Americans to make sacrifices, that they'd lead by example.
Yep, Dan, politicians are no different today than they were in my day, when you couldn't trust them to do what's right by the people any more than you could trust that a possum was dead and not just playing dead.
Think I'd be more likely to trust a possum than a Republican Congress member. Anyhow, there seems to be a pretty common theme that Congress has always been fucked up, not caring, dysfunctional. George, isn't today's Congress one of the most divided and divisive in our history? I mean, how was it like when the Declaration of Independence was being crafted?
Oh, sure. Though I really had nothing to do with it. And it was a good thing, too.
And why is that?
Well, I had a war to run. Now, besides, the way I heard it went down, way too political for me. All those debates and those arguments. You think today's Congress is divisive? You should have been around back then. I had delegates fighting over whether to be independent or not. It got quite emotional. And some of the delegates walked out. Well, finally, they got their act together and they voted to accept the document that Tommy and the others they worked so hard on. Now still, not all the members of the Continental Congress at that time signed the document.
Imagine arguing over whether to be independent or not. No question in my mind that it was conservatives who didn't want to be independent from England. After all, being independent was too progressive for them. Anyhow, back to Congressman Crockett. David, I believe you might feel differently about today's Congress, feeling the Republican and Tea Party Congress members have elevated dysfunction to a science.
I'm credited with saying I would rather be beaten and be a man than be elected and be a little puppet dog. I have always supported measures and principles and not men. I have acted fearless and independent, and I never will regret my course. I would rather be politically buried than to be hypocritically immortalized. I also said, I cannot nor will not forsake principle to follow after any party, and I do hope there may be a majority in Congress that may be governed by the same motive. Let me tell you, I have been following the shenanigans of today's Congressfolk, and I wouldn't be happy being among them. Well, I thought Congress in my day was dysfunctional at times and playing party politics. Hell, you have members of Congress who have made party politics a science, and if they have principles related to serving the common good, I've not seen them. Yeah, I'd be more to see a pig fly than some of those Republicans and Tea Party lawmakers favor the common good.
I'd like to continue this with Colonel Roosevelt. But before we do, let's watch a Fox News interview with former Republican Senator and presidential candidate Bob Dole on what he thinks of the Republican Party of today.
What do you think of your party, of the Republicans today?
I think they ought to put a sign on the National Committee doors that says closed for repairs until New Year's Day next year, and spend that time going over ideas and positive agendas.
You described the GOP of your generation as Eisenhower Republicans, moderate Republicans. Could people like Bob Dole, even Ronald Reagan, could you make it in today's Republican Party?
I doubt it. And Reagan couldn't have made it. Certainly Nixon couldn't have made it because he had ideas. And we might have made it, but I doubt it.
So, Colonel Roosevelt, as we just saw, Bob Dole, once the beloved head of the Republican Party, doubts that he and two former Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, would be accepted by today's Republicans and Tea Partiers. Sir, while you also were a Republican president, given how progressive your politics were, I seriously doubt whether today's Republicans and Tea Partiers would let you in their party as well. Do you share David's view of today's GOP?
While I was a Republican, I believed in government action to mitigate social evils, and I denounced what I referred to as the representatives of predatory wealth, as guilty of all forms of iniquity, from the oppression of wage workers to defrauding of the public. Fortunately, when I was president, I found an ally in an increasingly concerned public that was growing weary over the growing number and power of trusts or wealthy corporations. So I had their help, as well as the help of cooperative and compromising Congress in regulating offending corporations and not in busting or destroying them. As I look around today, I see offending corporations are flourishing, exercising undue power and influence on our government and placing their profit and greed above the common good. And I see that my old party, that once grand old party, has been bought and paid for, protecting the wealth and power of a few individuals and corporations rather than doing what's best for the American people.
Well stated, Colonel. You know, I'm hearing criticism in Congress from the three of you. What about the president? What should be his role in all of this?
Well, I held the view that the president was a steward of the people, and that, as president, I should take whatever action I felt was necessary for the public good. And while I did not usurp power, I did greatly broaden the use of executive power.
You know, sounds like a course of action that our current president should look into. And George, what about you? I understand you were offered a salary as president, but turned it down.
They offered me a salary of $25,000, and I turned it down. Now, separate from the fact that I was wealthy, I wanted to portray myself as a selfless public servant. However, Congress wisely got me to accept that salary to avoid setting a precedent where the presidency would only be perceived and limited to the independently wealthy individuals. Still, I feel the system today has been corrupt. I perceive that too many of today's public servants, they're in it more for the power and the money than to serve the people.
You got that right. And this is true for Congress folk on both sides of the aisle. Anyhow, you've been given high grades for a president, especially since you had no one before you as a role model. The current president, Barack Obama, likes to consider himself a champion of the middle class. Here we have a clip of his address on May 18th, 2013.
Over the past few months, I've laid out a series of common sense ideas to reignite the true engine of our economic growth, a rising, thriving middle class. The way I see it, there are three areas where we need to focus. One, making America a magnet for good jobs. Two, making sure our workers have the education and skills they need to do those jobs. And three, making sure your hard work leads to a decent living. In a little over 3 years, our businesses have created more than 6.5 million new jobs. And while our unemployment rate is still too high, it's the lowest it's been since 2008. But now we need to create even more good middle-class jobs, and we've got to do it faster. Corporate profits have skyrocketed to an all-time high. But now we need to get middle-class wages and incomes rising too. Our housing market is healing, but we need to do a lot more to help families stay in their homes or to help them refinance to take advantage of historically low rates. And our deficits, well, they're shrinking at the fastest rate in decades. But now we've got to budget in a smarter way that doesn't hurt middle-class families or harm critical investments in our future.
Colonel Roosevelt, you were a champion of the middle class, and it seems that the current president and you have a number of things in common.
My domestic program, which many refer to as the Square Deal, was formed upon three basic ideas: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. It was aimed at helping middle-class citizens and involved attacking wealthy and powerful individuals and large corporations, while at the same time protecting business from what I considered extreme demands on the part of organized labor.
Helping the middle class by attacking wealthy and powerful individuals and large corporations. Sure does seem that you and Obama do have a lot in common, being champions of the middle class and recognizing that wealthy and powerful individuals and corporations need to be slapped down and held responsible for their un-American deeds.
Yes, I'm a firm believer that the health and prosperity of America is fundamentally tied to the health and prosperity of its middle class, and that there are elements of our society, individuals and the large corporations they run, who seem to care about enriching themselves and milking the country.
Well, 100 years after your presidency, we're still faced with the same predicament, and it would seem that the Republican Party, your party, no longer cares about the middle class and cares more about enriching themselves and the wealthy individuals and corporations that fund their campaigns and enable their lifestyles.
Yes, that makes me both sad and angry. As a Republican, I can say I have seen America's enemy, and it is us.
You got that right. Meanwhile, one of the things President Obama talked about was education and training. Yet to many of us observing what's going on today, public education is under attack from those on the right, and it seems as if there's a purposeful intent to make Americans dumber and dumber. You know, whether it's because an educated population is more likely to question authority, while a relatively ignorant one is more programmable, or whether it's because corporate America wants to privatize education to better control people while further enriching themselves, I mean, two things are pretty clear. One, that America has a large segment of stupid people. And two, that far too many of our elected officials aren't very bright or informed. David, one of your proudest accomplishments was learning to read and write.
I wasn't the most learned of men, and I wasn't the most eloquent of speakers. Still, I taught myself to write and read and to act and subtract when I was 18 years old. Kind of disappointing that many of today's Americans, with a lot of them from my neck of the woods, are more illiterate when it comes to English than our folks whose native language isn't English.
And George, I know you were particularly upset when Michelle Bachmann, who is running for the Republican nomination for president in 2012, told a Concord, New Hampshire audience that she was proud to be where the shot heard round the world was fired, not realizing that the battles of Lexington and Concord, to mark the start of the Revolutionary War, were in Massachusetts. I mean, do you have some advice for those seeking office?
If you're running for a national office, you need to learn about the nation that you're seeking to govern, and particularly about our early history. and the issues for which we're fighting. There are those that have to pass a test to become a citizen, and who know more about this country than do the people who presently seek office. And they were born here. Perhaps we ought to have them take some type of history and citizenship test before they can run.
That's quite a novel idea, George. Right now, there doesn't seem to be any requirement to be a congressperson. And can you believe that the same Michelle Bachmann, who failed national history and geography in New Hampshire, is a member of the House Intelligence Committee? My Lord. Still, Bachmann recently announced her intention not to seek re-election, which some feel is related to her being investigated for misuse of campaign funds, which is a nice segue to talking about honesty in politics. Millions of Americans distrust politicians, knowing that many campaign promises are empty promises made in the heat of a campaign that a candidate has no intention of fulfilling if elected. Still, the 2012 Republican nominee for president, Mitt Romney, elevated lying to an art form. Whether during the campaign to become his party's nominee or running for the highest office in the land, Mitt Romney, dubbed Waffle Man because he waffled on so many of his stated positions, willfully lied to the American people on so many issues. So, going back to President Washington, George, you are considered to be one of the most honest men of your time, and there's a commonly known tale about you and your father and a cherry tree that you chopped down, where supposedly, when asked by your father about it, proclaimed your guilt and said something to the effect that you could not tell a lie.
That old story. It's quite bogus, you know.
Really?
Made up by somebody named Weems. There's no truth to it whatsoever.
So, the tale about your honesty is a fucking lie?
Welcome to Washington. You think that spinning the truth and making up stories about political leaders is a recent behavior? Au contraire, my friend. Besides, wasn't it Lincoln that put honesty in his name? Not me.
Wow. Well, let's get another perspective from someone famous for stretching the truth and making up tales. David, do you feel that today's Congress, or more specifically Republican and Tea Party members, are no different than the liars of your day?
I have a reputation as being one of the biggest tall tale tellers there ever was. Books and even a play were written about me featuring my own exaggerations of myself and my exploits, and even having exaggerations about me that weren't even mine. Still, my tall tales were all in fun, and were always told with a wink in my eye, and any mischief I caused was not malicious. Not the case today. There are a lot of tall tale tellers in positions of leadership and authority who tell their tall tales to purposefully mislead people and enrich themselves. Telling lies as if they were the truth and spinning yarns better than a spider spins a web. Sure makes me just a tad upset with these folks, and I wish I had old Betsy with me so that I could shoot the bullshit out of them. Just saying.
Well, I'm with you, David, and sure wish someone could shoot the bullshit out of them too. But right now we live in a society where there's far too much gun violence. And in response to particularly heinous mass shootings around the country, over 90% of Americans favor universal background checks for all gun sales, including those at gun shows, online, or out of someone's car trunk. Seems logical, no? Yet once again you have Republican and Tea Party congressfolk voting against this piece of gun safety legislation, and with their ignorant base of supporters, falsely believing lies that the government is after their guns and Second Amendment rights. Colonel Roosevelt, surely you have a point of view on this issue.
I'm a hunter, a cowboy, and an American, which means I like my guns. Even became a life member of the National Rifle Association while president in 1907, paying a $25 fee. However, while I am an NRA card carrier and a supporter of our Second Amendment, I don't believe our founding fathers, two of whom I'm on Mount Rushmore with, ever envisioned that arms would evolve into the killing machines they've become. Plus, when the right to bear arms was crafted into the Constitution, we didn't have a standing military and the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and departments we have now. So as one gun lover to another, ease off on the arsenal, and let's keep in mind that the right to bear arms shouldn't be a right for crooks or kooks.
And George, as a founding father, though not an author of the Constitution, how do you feel about gun nuts using the Second Amendment as an excuse to purchase semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity magazines?
Well, you know, that really pisses me off.
Well, all right then. Nothing quite like telling us how you really feel. Moving on, I'd now like to briefly talk about corporations. I know that some of our earlier discussion raised the subject of wealthy people and corporations and how they seek to further enrich themselves at the detriment of the middle class and those in need. Well, in 2010, the United States Supreme Court ruled that corporations are people, allowing the wealthy people behind corporations to channel more and more money toward candidates and toward influencing the outcome of elections than they might otherwise have been legally able to do prior to this ruling. So now we have more and more elected officials responding to their wealthy individual and corporate masters and basically saying to the American people, go fuck yourselves. Colonel Roosevelt, this can't possibly sit well with you.
The 1912 Progressive Party platform, which I was instrumental in crafting, referred to as an invisible government, an unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, whose destruction is the first task of the statesmanship of the day. 100 years later, that unholy alliance is alive and well, and what's worse is that millions of Americans believe this alliance to be holy. I went on to say that this country belongs to the people. Its resources, its businesses, its laws, its institutions should be utilized, maintained, or altered in whatever manner will best promote the general interest. Makes me angry that many of today's leaders, especially those calling themselves Republicans, appear not to give a damn about promoting the general interest. Perhaps they should be busted.
Whether it's shooting lying congressfolk, as David might like to do, or busting greedy people and corporations, as you suggest, it would seem that something has to be done, and perhaps in ways other than at the ballot box. Anyhow, there's one more topic I'd like to cover with the three of you, and it concerns immigration, one of the major issues of today, with one of President Obama's main goals in his second term being comprehensive immigration reform. Why don't we take a look at what President Obama said about this shortly after his re-election in 2012.
And when I say comprehensive immigration reform, it is very similar to the outlines of previous efforts at comprehensive immigration reform. I think it should include a continuation of the strong border security measures that we've taken, because we have to secure our borders. I think it should contain serious penalties for companies that are purposely hiring undocumented workers and taking advantage of them. And I do think that there should be a pathway for legal status for those who are living in this country, are not engaged in criminal activity, are here simply to work. It's important for them to pay back taxes. It's important for them to learn English. It's important for them to potentially pay a fine. But to give them the avenue whereby they can resolve their legal status here in this country, I think is very important. Obviously, making sure that we put into law what the first step that we've taken administratively dealing with the DREAM Act kids is very important as well. One thing that I'm very clear about is that young people who are brought here through no fault of their own, who have gone to school here, pledged allegiance to our flag, want to serve in our military, want to go to school and contribute to our society, that they shouldn't be under the cloud of deportation, that we should give them every opportunity to earn their citizenship. And so, there are other components to it, obviously. The business community continues to be concerned about getting enough high-skilled workers, and I am a believer that if you've got a PhD in physics or computer science who wants to stay here and start a business here, we shouldn't make it harder for him to stay here. We should try to encourage him to contribute to this society. I think that the agricultural sector obviously has very specific concerns about making sure that they've got a workforce that helps deliver food to our tables. So there are going to be a bunch of components to it, but I think whatever process we have needs to make sure border security is strong, needs to deal with employers effectively, needs to provide a pathway for the undocumented here, needs to deal with the DREAM Act kids, and I think that's something that we can get done.
President Washington, George, in your farewell address upon leaving the presidency, you emphasized that regardless of what our ethnicity, origins, beliefs might be, that we should first and foremost recognize that we're Americans.
I urged people to place their identity as Americans along with their independence and liberty above and beyond any slight differences. Now, sadly, there are those who profit from magnifying those differences. I feel we have not been this divided since our Civil War 150 years ago.
Yes, it is sad that there are forces in this nation that seek to promote our differences in order to divide us. It's also sad that many Americans fail to forget that we're a nation of immigrants and that no one has the right to be here, well, perhaps, other than those who were here before any European set foot on this land. And in my opinion, what we immigrants did to them, kind of disqualifies us to be judging who can come and stay and who can't. David, do you have something to say on this?
I was considered by some to be an Indian killer, having participated in a massacre of Creeks at Taloosahatchee to avenge what happened at Fort Mims, and then when ferreting them out of the Florida swamps. And it's true that my great-grandpappy, for whom I was named, was killed by them. Still, I wasn't in favor of forcing Indians, Native Americans, off a land they had known as theirs long before we even landed on this soil. And I wasn't in favor of relocating them hundreds and hundreds of miles away from their native land and then sequestering them like they were prisoners and then having corrupt white Indian agents get rich off their misery. I know that many consider Andrew Jackson to be a great president and a man of the people. Way I reckon, his treatment of our Indian brethren is a stain upon his legacy and the primary reason I broke with him.
More than being just the legacy of Andrew Jackson, our treatment of Native Americans is a stain on our nation's history, and it should serve as a reminder of how intolerant, bigoted, and evil we Americans can be to others who have what we want or who look, behave, and believe differently than some of us do. But let's get back to the issue facing us today, where the immigration debate is primarily focused on Hispanics from Mexico and Central and Latin America. Colonel Roosevelt, what are your views on immigration?
In an article I wrote in 1894 on immigration, I stated, "We must Americanize in every way, in speech, in political ideas, and in principles, and in the way of looking at relations between church and state." I went on to say that America welcomes the foreigner who becomes an American and has no use for the foreigner who remains a foreigner, that they must revere our flag. Not only must it come first, no flag should even come second. As I look at America today and how it regards immigration and immigrants, it seems we've lost our way. While I respect the heritage and culture of native countries, I also recognize that immigrants choose to come here, and as such, they need to adopt our culture, values, and language and adapt to our American way of life. What's this press one for English? On a related note, I, like George Washington, am not in favor of hyphenated Americans, as it seems to suggest one places their loyalty and affinity to a country or heritage other than America.
Well stated, Colonel. Personally, I feel the failure of many Hispanic immigrants to adopt English as their primary language, and having signage in both English and Spanish to accommodate Hispanic immigrants is a major unspoken reason for being anti-immigration. That it's the exceptional nature of these immigrants that's objected to, since earlier wave of immigrants not speaking English or their children had to learn English and appear to have willingly done so. Anyhow, we've come to the end of our show, and I'd like to close our panel discussion with President Washington, figuring if he's good enough to be first, he's surely good enough to be last. George, the America we live in today appears quite divided, often on issues that pertain to equality, freedom, and rights. As one of our founding fathers and our first president, what words of wisdom can you leave with us today?
Let me just say that many regard me as the first in war, the first in peace, and the first in the hearts of his countrymen. But I would like to remind Americans that they are the first in my heart. I look forward to when more and more of them truly embrace that all men and women are created equal, and they have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without denying those same rights to others.
Thank you, George. And thanks to our other panel members, Theodore Roosevelt and David Crockett, for an inspiring first show. So until next week, this is Dan Gersten, and on behalf of myself and the rest of the WTF News team, thank you for watching.